January 30th, 1945. The Baltic, near freezing. A 684-foot liner cuts through darkness with more than 10,000 souls aboard. Women, children, wounded soldiers, refugees, packed into every corridor, stairwell, even a drained swimming pool. The Wilhelm Gustloff was designed for 1,900. Tonight, she carries 5 times that. At 9:16 p.m., 3 torpedoes from Soviet submarine S-13 slam into her hull. In under an hour, she is gone. With her, an estimated 9,000 lives. That is 6 times the Titanic's death toll. It was the deadliest shipwreck in recorded history, yet most of the world has never heard of it. How a Nazi pleasure liner became a frozen coffin and why it was erased from memory begins in a Hamburg shipyard 8 years earlier. In the spring of 1937, the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg became the stage for a spectacle that would echo across the Third Reich. Steel plates clanged into place as workers assembled the hull of a ship unlike any Germany had ever built. She would stretch 684 feet from bow to stern, weigh in at 25,484 gross registered tons, and carry the promise of a new era, at least on paper. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not just a vessel. She was a floating symbol, crafted for the Nazi Strength Through Joy program. Her mission was to erase class barriers at sea, offering the same cabins, the same meals, and the same views to every passenger, whether factory worker or party official. On May 5, 1937, the launch drew thousands to the harbor's edge. Adolf Hitler himself stood before the gleaming hull, flanked by Robert Ley and the shipyard's executives. Cameras flashed as he delivered a brief speech, calling the ship a gift from German workers to the German people. The words echoed over the crowd, blending with the sharp pop of a champagne bottle smashed against the bow. As the Wilhelm Gustloff slid into the Elbe, banners snapped in the wind, and the press immortalized the moment. A nation's pride, embodied in steel and promise, gliding into the water for the first time. Inside, the ship was a marvel of egalitarian design. There were no first-class suites or hidden luxury decks. Instead, over 1,000 identical cabins lined 5 decks, each furnished simply but comfortably. Grand dining halls, a ballroom with Art Deco chandeliers, and a swimming pool with blue-tiled mosaics offered leisure without hierarchy. Promotional brochures boasted of a vessel where all Germans could sail together, and workers' diaries from the inaugural cruises described evenings filled with music, laughter, and speeches that blurred the line between holiday and indoctrination. But beneath the surface, propaganda saturated every detail. The ship's name honored Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi martyr, and the KDF emblem was emblazoned on her funnel. Every voyage doubled as a showcase for the regime's vision. A carefully staged harmony, with Hitler's blessing stamped on every ticket and photograph. For a time, the Gustloff was the pride of Nazi engineering, a floating promise that the future belonged to the unified German people. Yet, as her hull gleamed under the floodlights and her decks filled with hopeful passengers, the same steel would soon be repurposed for war, and the dream would curdle into nightmare. In the spring and summer of 1938, the Wilhelm Gustloff set out from Hamburg, her decks gleaming and her cabins filled not with officers or aristocrats, but with factory workers, machinists, and their families. For many, this was the first time they set foot on a ship, let alone sailed beyond the horizon. The tickets, subsidized by the Kraft durch Freude program, cost little more than a week's wages, no velvet ropes, no first-class privilege. On board, everyone dined together in vast halls where the clatter of cutlery mixed with the strains of a dance band. The Gustloff's itinerary read like a dream, up the North Sea to Norway's fjords, where waterfalls tumbled down sheer rock faces and snow still clung to the peaks in June. and south to the sunlit harbors of Madeira, with stops at Lisbon and Vigo where passengers marveled at whitewashed towns and palm-lined promenades. Crew logs and Kraft durch Freude brochures from those first years describe a world where seasickness and homesickness were soothed by endless rounds of games, lectures, and concerts. Each cabin, whether occupied by a Ruhr miner or a Berlin office clerk, offered the same view of the rolling Atlantic. In the evenings, the ballroom filled with laughter as couples swayed under the Art Deco lights. A machinist named Ernst wrote to his wife that they were all equals there. No one was better, and no one was worse. The sea belonged to them all. On the open decks, children ran between lifeboats while their mothers watched the horizon, and fathers leaned on the railings, smoking and swapping stories. The ship's daily program promised excursions ashore, language lessons, even lectures on the virtues of German unity. Yet beneath the camaraderie, every voyage was carefully choreographed. The Kraft durch Freude emblem on the funnel, the ever-present slogans, and the speeches at each port reminded passengers that this holiday was also a lesson in loyalty. The Gustloff's voyages to Norway and Madeira were widely covered in the press, with photographs of sunburned workers waving flags and singing patriotic songs. For a brief time, the promise of leisure, of a nation united at sea, felt real. But as the summer of 1939 faded, the mood grew uncertain. Rumors of war drifted across the decks. The last peacetime cruise returned to Hamburg in August, and the ship's future, once filled with music and light, would soon be claimed by darkness. Bare steel replaced polished wood. By 1942, the Wilhelm Gustloff's grand ballrooms and dining halls were stripped to their bones. Gone were the Art Deco chandeliers, the laughter, and the illusion of unity at sea. In their place, naval engineers bolted rows of wooden bunks, stacking bodies 3 and 4 high where couples once danced. The ship's transformation was ruthless and efficient. Luxury cabins gutted, walls torn down, every available space crammed with cots. What had been a floating showcase for Nazi leisure now became a dormitory for war. Medical staff worked under harsh fluorescent lights. Their former sickbay expanded into a sprawling field hospital. Operating tables, sterilization trays, and crates of morphine-lined corridors that once echoed with music. The ship's original design, meant for 1,465 tourists, was pushed far beyond its limits. Temporary partitions carved up the old ballroom, turning it into a warren of bunks for U-boat trainees, young men barely out of school, sleeping shoulder to shoulder, their gear stowed in the last empty corners. The swimming pool, drained and covered, became another sleeping area. Even the promenade deck, once reserved for sunbathing, now sheltered cots and stretchers, exposed to the Baltic wind. Safety was sacrificed for capacity. Lifeboats that once ringed the upper decks were removed to make room for anti-aircraft guns and more bunks. By 1944, only a fraction of the original lifeboats remained, just enough for a small portion of those now aboard. The engineers who oversaw these changes kept meticulous logs: the number of bunks installed, the weight limits of each deck, the dwindling count of life jackets and rafts. One entry, dated March 1944, notes, "Capacity increased to 5,000. Lifeboats reduced to 22. No further expansion possible without structural risk." The ship's hull, battered by years of coastal duty, showed signs of fatigue. Rust crept along the seams. Pumps and boilers, rarely used while the Gustloff was moored as a barracks in Gotenhofen, became unreliable. Engine rooms echoed with the clatter of tools and the muttered complaints of engineers working double shifts. The medical staff, now numbering in the hundreds, adapted as best they could. Field surgeons operated on wounded soldiers brought in from the Eastern Front, sometimes by candlelight when the generators failed. For the men and women living aboard, daily life blurred into routine. Roll calls at dawn, drills in narrow corridors, the constant shuffle of boots on metal decks. A nurse recalled in her diary, "We sleep in shifts. The air smells of oil and sweat. At night, the ship feels like a prison. No windows, no sky. Only the sound of men breathing in the dark." The Gustloff, once a promise of equality at sea, now embodied the opposite. The vessel could hold thousands, but every addition meant another body competing for air, food, and a chance at survival. By early 1945, the ship was little more than a floating barracks, stripped, overcrowded, and dangerously unprepared for what was coming. In the bitter January of 1945, the Eastern Front collapsed in a matter of days. Soviet tanks rolled across the frozen Vistula, cutting through what was left of German defenses in East Prussia. The Red Army's Vistula-Oder offensive, launched on January 12, swept westward with a force that stunned even seasoned Wehrmacht officers. Villages emptied overnight. Entire towns vanished into the columns of refugees clogging the icy roads, driven by rumors of violence and vengeance, tales of the Nemmersdorf massacre, of families slaughtered in their homes, repeated in whispers and shouted in panic. By the third week of January, the Baltic coast became a bottleneck for the desperate. Trains stopped running. The roads were blocked by carts, prams, wounded soldiers hobbling on crutches, and mothers carrying infants wrapped in blankets against a -20-degree wind. For many, the only hope lay in the sea. The ports of Gotenhafen, Pillau, and Danzig filled with tens of thousands clamoring for a place on any ship bound west. The scale was staggering. More than 2 million civilians and soldiers would pass through these ports in the coming months, a movement greater than Dunkirk, larger even than the post-war Magic Carpet Fleet. On January 21, Admiral Karl Dönitz, now the Supreme Commander of the German Navy, issued the order that set Operation Hannibal in motion. Every available vessel, from warships to fishing trawlers, was pressed into service. The directive was simple: evacuate as many as possible, as fast as possible, before the Soviet advance made escape impossible. Dönitz's staff in Hamburg coordinated the chaos, but on the ground, order dissolved under the weight of numbers. Official records show more than 1,300 ships would participate by war's end. The Gustloff, stripped of her former glory, was recalled from her mooring at Gotenhafen. Her hull battered, her decks already crowded with the wounded and the young. Among the refugees waiting at the docks was a nurse named Anna, carrying a child not her own. In a letter later found in the ruins of Gotenhafen, she wrote that the crowd pressed so tightly that she could not feel her feet. They waited for hours, listening for the sound of engines, for any ship that might take them away from the guns. Nearby, naval officers tried to impose order, reading names from lists that quickly became meaningless as the surge of bodies overwhelmed every checkpoint. The Gustloff was designed for just over 1,400 passengers. That night, she would be loaded with more than 10,000. The urgency on the docks was echoed in the command centers. Dönitz's decision was not born of strategy, but of necessity. The Wehrmacht could no longer hold the line. As Soviet artillery drew closer, the logic of survival replaced any thought of victory. The evacuation became a race against time, against the ice, against the fear that the next shell would fall before the last child boarded. Operation Hannibal would evacuate more than 2 million people before the war ended, a feat unmatched in naval history. But for the thousands pressed onto the Gustloff's decks, the promise of safety was already slipping away, lost in the crush of the desperate and the doomed. Bodies pressed together, the Wilhelm Gustloff's decks became a maze of exhaustion and fear. Every available space, from corridors and lounges to stairwells, was packed with refugees. The grand dining halls, once alive with music and light, now echoed with the restless shifting of thousands trying to sleep on bare floors or thin mattresses. The swimming pool, drained and scrubbed, had been transformed into a grid of wooden bunks. Where children once played, families now squeezed together, the air thick with breath and worry. In the old poolside changing rooms, mothers clutched infants, teenagers curled around battered suitcases, fathers wedged in beside strangers, all pressed into spaces never meant for sleeping. On the pool deck, mattresses covered every inch, forming a patchwork field where people slept shoulder to shoulder. The white railings, stripped of safety nets, offered no comfort, only a cold reminder of what the space had once been. The promenade, once a place for sea air and sunlight, was now a wind-battered shelter, tarps and blankets tied between lifeboat davits to block the Baltic chill. At night, the ship's windows glowed faintly through frost, but inside the air was heavy with sweat, wet wool, and fear. A nurse named Anna wrote that there were bodies on every deck and that she had never seen so many people in one place. She wrote that they lay in rows, waiting for morning, for news, for anything. Some children wept quietly, rocked by their mothers in the dark. Others stared at the ceiling, listening to the hull groan and the distant engines rumble. The ship, built for just over 1,400, now held more than 10,000. There was no privacy, no room to stretch, only the press of bodies and the knowledge that in an emergency there would not be enough lifeboats or life jackets. The strain was everywhere, in the lines for latrines, in hoarse voices calling for water, in the way people clung to their belongings. The Gustloff's safety systems, stripped for war, were hopelessly outmatched. On that cold January night, the ship was less a vessel than a floating city of the displaced, where hope and dread mingled in every breath. A harried naval quartermaster stood in the Gustloff's purser's office, pencil in hand, eyes darting between the official manifest and the sea of faces outside. The ship's logbook, stamped and signed by the authorities at Gotenhofen, listed 6,050 names, each one a neat entry, a number in a column. But the lists were already meaningless. In the chaos of that January night, order dissolved in minutes. Families surged past the checkpoint, some clutching papers, others with nothing but a name shouted over the din. Soldiers, wounded on stretchers, were lifted aboard with no record at all. Children slipped through gaps in the guard lines, bundled in blankets, their existence known only to a desperate parent. The quartermaster tried to keep count, but the crowd pressed forward, overwhelming every system. He scribbled notes in the margins. Extra children, unknown number, wounded, no tally, civilians, unlisted. By the time the gangways were pulled up, the ship carried not just the 6,050 on paper, but thousands more. Eyewitnesses would later estimate over 10,000. The gap between official numbers and reality was not a rounding error. It was a gulf into which whole families vanished. On the upper deck, a nurse named Anna counted heads in her care. Her list showed 7 children, but she could see at least a dozen huddled around her, some whose names she would never know. Down in the engine room, a machinist watched as sailors squeezed in extra bunks, ignoring every safety limit. The manifest said there were enough life jackets for everyone, but the quartermaster's own tally told a different story. Hundreds short, and no way to fix it now. The official record, later recovered from the archives, would preserve the illusion of control, listing 5,895 soldiers, 970 evacuees, and 185 crew. But photographs from the dockside and the testimony of those who survived reveal a different truth, of bodies packed into every corridor, of children and elders who never made it onto any list. In the end, bureaucratic order was no match for the panic of flight. The Gustloff sailed with a manifest that could never account for the real scale of loss about to unfold. The Wilhelm Gustloff slipped out of Gotenhofen with only a single escort, the torpedo boat T-36. The original plan had called for more protection, but one after another, the other escorts were forced to drop away. mechanical failure struck the minesweeper M105 before departure, its engines refusing to turn over in the freezing dark. The Gustloff, burdened with thousands of civilians and wounded, was left to trust its fate to T-36 and the hope that the Baltic's winter fog would hide them from prowling submarines. Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Schmidt, commander of T-36, paced his narrow bridge, scanning the horizon for periscopes or the faint shimmer of a torpedo's wake. Schmidt's crew had spent days running rescue drills, their faces pinched with cold and fear. They knew the Gustloff was a floating prize, slow, overloaded, and now without a proper screen. The Baltic in January was a graveyard for ships, and Soviet submarines had been sighted along the evacuation routes. Every officer aboard T-36 understood that if trouble came, they would be the only line between the Gustloff and disaster. As night fell, the sense of isolation deepened. The Gustloff's engines, long neglected while the ship served as a barracks, rattled and coughed. The convoy crawled through the darkness, the torpedo boat weaving close to the liner's hull, its searchlights probing the mist. A single escort for a vessel carrying more than 10,000 souls made even experienced sailors uneasy. One of Schmidt's officers later wrote in his diary that they were a shield made of paper, and if the enemy found them, they would not last 5 minutes. With every mile westward, the ship grew more vulnerable. The frozen sea offered no cover, and the radio crackled with warnings of Soviet submarines ahead. On the Gustloff's bridge, the captain weighed impossible choices, knowing that a single mistake could doom everyone aboard. The reduction in escort was not a tactical decision but a symptom of a navy stretched to the breaking point. Mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and the chaos of retreat leaving the Gustloff exposed, alone, and easy to find. In the silence between engine thuds, the only constant was the knowledge that help, should it be needed, would not arrive in time. The ship pressed on, its fate sealed not by a single decision, but by a slow, relentless stripping away of every protection the sea could offer. Night pressed down over the Baltic, thick with fog and fear, as the Wilhelm Gustloff crept through the darkness. On the bridge, Captain Peterson faced a decision that would echo far beyond the steel and glass of his command. The ship's only escort, the torpedo boat T-36, had fallen behind in the haze, its silhouette lost in the shifting gloom. Radio chatter warned of submarines prowling nearby, but in the chaos of retreat, the risk of collision seemed just as real as the threat beneath the waves. At 3:10 hours, an order cut through the confusion. Switch on the navigation lights. Floodlights snapped to life along the decks. Running lights burned red and green at the bow and stern, and the Gustloff, already overloaded and already vulnerable, became a glowing shape against the Black Sea. Survivors would later remember how the sudden blaze of light cast long, trembling shadows across the faces crowded at the railings. For a moment, the ship seemed less like a vessel in flight and more like a lantern adrift, advertising its presence to anyone watching. The command had not come from Peterson alone. Layers of authority crowded the bridge that night. Naval officers, a training commander, and a liaison from high command, all weighing different dangers. Some argued that darkness brought the risk of collision with the escort or mines, while others whispered warnings of enemy submarines. In the end, the fear of losing the escort in the fog outweighed every other concern. The lights went on, and with them, any hope of remaining hidden vanished. Down on the decks, a nurse named Anna pressed her palm to the glass, watching the sea swallow the ship's reflection. She wrote in her diary, "We were told it was for our safety, but I have never felt so exposed." Out beyond the shaft of light, Soviet submarine S-13 waited in silence. Its commander, Alexander Marinesko, peered through the periscope and saw not just a ship, but a broad, illuminated target. The Gustloff's fate, decided in that moment, was sealed by a handful of men on a foggy bridge. Men who believed they were choosing the lesser of two dangers, never knowing they had turned the ship into a beacon for the hunter lying in wait. Through the lens of the periscope, the Wilhelm Gustloff glowed against the black Baltic, her navigation lights burning through the fog. In the cramped control room of Soviet submarine S-13, Captain Alexander Marinesco watched and waited. He had hunted German shipping for years, but this was different. A vast, illuminated target, heavy with the weight of war and flight. The Gustloff, once a symbol of Nazi leisure, now drifted as a beacon for destruction. Marinesco's orders were clear. Disrupt the German evacuation. Strike hard at the enemy's retreat. The S-13's log for January 30th, 1945, records visual contact at 21:05 hours. The submarine tracked the liner's slow progress, engines barely keeping pace, decks crowded far beyond their design. Marinesco's crew loaded 4 torpedoes into the tubes, each one marked for a ship carrying thousands, soldiers, nurses, mothers, infants. He noted in his diary that the destruction of this floating palace would cripple the enemy's hopes of escape. At precisely 21:16 hours, the order was given. 3 torpedoes sped through the freezing water, aimed at the Gustloff's starboard side. The first struck near the bow, tearing open the forward compartments. The second detonated beneath the drained swimming pool, a space now packed with refugees. The third found the engine room, killing the engineers and plunging the ship into darkness. Within seconds, the liner's power failed. Lights flickered and died, leaving only the muffled roar of water and the panicked cries of those trapped below decks. The impact sites were chosen for maximum effect. Marinesco, a man shaped by war's brutal arithmetic, targeted the areas most likely to cripple the ship and sow chaos. The loss of power meant that radios fell silent, elevators and pumps stopped, and the Gustloff's ability to maneuver or call for help vanished. On board, a nurse named Anna remembered the moment as a sudden, sickening jolt, followed by the sound of steel screaming and the rush of icy air through the corridors. The torpedo boat T-36, the Gustloff's lone escort, picked up the explosions and turned back, but the damage was done. The liner began to list sharply to starboard, water flooding the lower decks at a rate no one could stop. Survivors later described the sensation as the floor tilting beneath their feet, bodies sliding across the decks, stairwells filling with the desperate and the doomed. For Marinesco, the attack was both personal and political. Born in Kharkiv, the son of a Romanian father and Ukrainian mother, he had faced suspicion from his own command. Yet here, in the cold mathematics of war, he seized his moment. His actions would earn him the Order of the Red Banner and years later, recognition as a hero of the Soviet Union. But on that night, his only concern was the target illuminated before him, a ship transformed by war, now fatally exposed by a single decision on the bridge. 3 torpedoes, 45 minutes. The mechanics of disaster set in motion, leaving thousands to face the Baltic darkness with nowhere to run. The Baltic night swallowed the Gustloff's lights as the last echoes of metal and screaming faded into the wind. In that sudden hush, the sea was broken only by the desperate splashes of those still alive. Water at 2 degrees above freezing bit through soaked clothing and skin. Within minutes, hands and feet went numb. Lungs seized. Breath came in short, panicked bursts. Most never made it far from the sinking wreck. Some clung to rafts or overturned lifeboats, their bodies pressed against strangers in a silent fight for warmth. Others drifted alone, eyes fixed on a sky that offered no help. Silence rescue was a race against time and cold. The German torpedo boat T-36, the minesweeper M341, and the auxiliary vessel Low cut through the darkness, guided by the faint cries of survivors. Searchlights swept across the water, illuminating faces pale with terror and shock. On the deck of the Low, sailors threw lines and nets to those who could still raise an arm. A young woman, her hands too stiff to grip the rope, was hauled aboard by her coat. She remembered the moment later. The surface was a sheet of black glass, and her fingers went numb the instant they touched the deck. Deck numbers defy comprehension. Out of more than 10,000 people on board, only about 1,230 survived the night. The rest, an estimated 9,000, were lost to the sea, including nearly 5,000 children. The cold did not discriminate. Mothers and infants, wounded soldiers, sailors, and the elderly all vanished together in the same silent grave. For those in the water, survival was measured in minutes. The Red Cross later reported that without a lifeboat or raft, few lasted more than a quarter of an hour before slipping beneath the waves. Survival. On the Low's deck, rescue crews worked in grim silence. Survivors arrived soaked and shivering, their skin blue and lips cracked from the cold. Some could not speak. Others clung to rescuers, unable to let go. A sailor remembered pulling a child from a floating door, the boy's arms locked around a frozen doll. One nurse, pulled aboard after hours in the water, could not move her hands at all. She stared at them, uncomprehending, as medics wrapped her in blankets. Grim bodies floated in the ship's wake, still turned toward the sky. The sea around the wreck became a field of loss, life jackets, broken boards, and silent faces drifting in the current. The rescue ships filled quickly, their holds packed with the living and the dead. Medical officers marked the names of those saved, but for most, there was no record, no manifest, no tally, only memory and absence. Wake. When dawn broke, the Baltic was calm again. The Gustloff was gone, swallowed whole. Survivors huddled together on the decks of the rescue vessels, wrapped in whatever blankets could be found. Some stared at the horizon in shock. Others whispered the names of children, parents, or friends lost in the night. The scale of the disaster defied language. The Gustloff had carried more than 6 times the number of people lost on the Titanic, yet there would be no headlines, no global mourning, only a silence as deep as the sea itself. History's silence around the Gustloff endures, proof that even the deadliest tragedies can vanish beneath shifting tides of memory and ideology. When dreams are built for propaganda and shattered by total war, the true cost is measured not just in numbers, but in forgotten lives. Today, selective remembrance still shapes whose grief is honored and whose is erased. What we choose to remember and what we choose to forget defines us. Share your thoughts below.